Hello, friends, and welcome to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, an ADHD woman with EDS, POTS, complex PTSD, and OCD, shaped by an abusive religious upbringing. I spent much of my life feeling like I was balancing precariously over an endless pit, constantly reaching for a stable home that always seemed just out of reach. Today, I can honestly say that home is wherever I am right now, built on the stable ground that's growing out of a deepening relationship with my body and myself. In this podcast, I share the lived experiences that brought me here, in case it helps someone feel less alone or supports them on their own journey home. Before getting started with this week's topic, I wanted to mention that I unfortunately got behind after starting the YouTube channel associated with this podcast. So I'll be skipping next week's episode in order to catch up. But if you didn't know that there was a YouTube channel, now you know. If that type of listening is more accessible or more pleasant to you, please feel free to go ahead and listen over on YouTube. It is unfortunately just a still image video. I haven't quite yet gotten up the confidence to record myself. I also don't really have a space to do that. My house is very small currently, but maybe one day. That's something that I would like to invest some time and effort into figuring out how to do. But for now, this week, the topic is the specific realization of how I was parentified all throughout my childhood. So, this specific realization came when my earlier role in the family stopped being interpreted as normal responsibility, and I recognized it as a form of emotional role reversal. The turning point was understanding that this constant monitoring, mediating, and stabilizing of parental emotions had not been voluntary care, but was an imposed function on a child within an unsafe relational system. So this reframed both my childhood experiences and my later relationship patterns as repetition of a learned caretaking role rather than evidence of love or obligation. I was, of course, emotionally parentified all throughout my childhood. I served as the emotional center for my parents' well being. There are, of course, different types of parentification, right? I think there's like more practical physical caretaking parentification, like if you have younger siblings and your parents weren't caring for them properly and you had to step in and be, or you were assigned by your parents to be the caretaker, or maybe one of your parents was struggling with addiction and you had to like physically clean up after them, or food wouldn't be made if you didn't make it, etc., etc. But I personally experienced primarily emotional parentification, so that's what I will be focusing on. Only well into adulthood did I actually begin to understand that I had been forced into a role that required a child to carry emotional responsibilities that should never have belonged to them, right? Because at the time, it felt so natural, almost expected, to prioritize my parents' emotional needs over my own. Like, I had never known anything different. I think that's something very important to remember. When we come into this world, we don't know anything different. All we know is what we grew up with, until we become an adult and starts recognizing that different people had different childhoods. Maybe what we experienced wasn't normal. But I do think it's very natural for us to grow up thinking that's normal because that's all we ever knew. I think a lot of times there's sort of blame placed on people who grew up being traumatized or being parentified, they're like, well, why did you put up with it? You didn't have to do that. And it's like, yeah, you know that as an adult, but a child who has never experienced anything different, that is not their fault at all. So, anyway, it's also important to mention that because I grew up responsible for managing the emotions of my primary attachment figures, I internalized the idea that love is tied to caretaking. And I think that was a really important realization for me, that love is actually obligation and caretaking. I mean, it's not, but that's what I thought it was, right? So in adulthood relationships, if I had to be a caretaker in order for the relationship to function, if I felt obligated in the relationship, that kind of falsely gave me an impression of, oh, this is love, right? That means that this is real love because I feel obligated, because I feel resentful, because I have to step in and be the caretaker. And that is absolutely not true. This realization caused an internal shift inside of me. So, what changed internally was the shift from automatic responsibility for others' emotional states to questioning that responsibility altogether. Boundaries became visible as something that could exist rather than something that would cause guilt if enforced. Care stopped being the default measure of worth or connection, and self prioritization became less associated with danger or abandonment. So, parentification can occur as instrumental parentification, where a child manages practical tasks such as maintaining the household, or emotional parentification, where the child becomes a source of emotional support for a parent or family member, often acting as a mediator, confidant, or stabilizing presence. In adult relationships, this can appear as taking on the role of emotional manager by monitoring a partner's feelings, mediating conflicts, organizing life logistics, or absorbing stress to keep the relationship stable. When one partner consistently becomes the organizer, motivator, and emotional regulator for the other, the dynamic can resemble a parent child relationship rather than an equal partnership. So, this makes me think of the term man keeping, and I will just say that as a woman who thought she was straight for 30 years, that's my primary experience with this. Of course, it can happen with any gender or heterosexual, homosexual, etc. But I do think that, the data shows that there is very much a trend in heterosexual relationships, and my feminist streak insists that I point this out. There is very much a default where the woman who has been socialized to be a caretaker takes on the emotional labor of the relationship, and the man who has been socialized to offload emotional labor onto the women in his life, you know, just kind of coasts through the relationship, and it does often resemble more of a parent child relationship than an equal partnership. And I just think this is important to mention because I think that it is relevant. I think that these two things can interact, right? Being raised, being parentified, and then also existing in this very heteronormative environment where women are expected to do all of the emotional labor and a lot of times all of the, practical labor as well. Um, I just think it's important to recognize that these two things can very much feed into each other in terms of keeping women kind of unconsciously trapped in these cycles of caretaking. You acted as the parent when you were a kid, and then in your adult relationship, you just continue acting as a parent. Because, the thing that we aren't taught in this heteronormative world, or that we aren't taught when we grow up being parentified, is that is not a healthy partnership, right? The only time where one person should function as the emotional caretaker is when that is a parent to a child. And so I think it can be very hard to then grow up and be like, well, what is a healthy partnership? Um, so anyway, to me, though, the sort of caregiver dynamic felt familiar as I struggled with boundaries, felt guilty prioritizing my own needs, and was drawn to partners who required significant support. I mean, I do think it becomes even a part of the attraction. If you associate love with caregiving, you're going to be more attracted to the types of people who need more caregiving. And that's really frustrating and sad, but it's also true. And I think recognizing it is the first step to breaking out of that cycle. So, while this isn't technically parentification in the original childhood sense, it is recreating a caretaking role learned earlier in life. And only recently have I learned how to disentangle these obligatory caretaking and patriarchy mandated emotional labor relationships. Um, Only now have I learned to disentangle that type of relationship from consenting, loving, equal adult relationships. This recognition of parentification and shift away from obligatory caretaking in relationships shaped my ability to feel at home anywhere by moving my sense of home away from managing other people's emotional stability. Instead of belonging being tied to caretaking or vigilance, it became tied to internal steadiness and choice. As the need to regulate others diminished, physical and relational environments became less determining of safety, allowing a more consistent sense of groundedness regardless of setting, right? Instead of other people's emotions are my responsibility, now it's my emotions are my responsibility. For so long, I was so busy caretaking other people's emotional states that I never took the time to caretake my own emotional state. And that seems like such a simple shift, but it took me a really long time to realize it and to actually make it happen. So I guess it wasn't so simple after all. And the that's I think because the expectations created by parentification can place significant pressure on a developing child and often cause long-term effects like difficulty setting boundaries, chronic feelings of responsibility for others, anxiety, burnout. I will say though, interestingly, I did come across some information that sometimes individuals do develop strengths through these experiences, like heightened empathy, emotional awareness, resilience, independence, and strong problem solving abilities. And I would say that that's true. Um, I think I have some of these skills. I don't think that is in any way like a way to dismiss these experiences, right? And be like, oh, well, it's fine because you developed these awesome skills. But I do think it can be a way for someone who was parentified and is understandably angry about it to kind of recognize, like, well, maybe I can leverage these skills. Maybe I can get something out of it. I don't know. I do think we should stop parentifying kids. But so, as an example of some parentification experiences, my father was prone to violent rages in which he would break inanimate objects, never people, but we all know how fine the line can be between the two. And I frequently felt unconsciously responsible for monitoring his level of frustration and anger, providing the nervous system soothing for him that he could not provide for himself, and he definitely couldn't provide for me. So, in that sense, taking on this burden of monitoring his levels of frustration and anger was a safety mechanism. It was becoming the parent of my own parent in order to stop violence from happening. And that can definitely have a huge effect on a developing child. And another example, I was constantly listening to worries and marriage problems from my mother, particularly that I didn't fully understand. I was constantly trying to diffuse the tension between them and quietly took on the role of mediator when things felt unstable. Like they would always come to me when they had problems with each other. And I was like 14, and I had no idea how to mediate. I was not a couples counselor, and yet I was frequently treated like one. So that's an example of, you know, adults not being able to regulate their own conflicts, and a child is forced to step into the middle of it in order to not have a home full of screaming and shouting and arguments and things like mom's too busy arguing with dad to take the kid to school or whatever. And I don't know if you experienced any of these things, maybe just take a moment to sit with it. Like, I don't necessarily share these examples to say, oh, I had it so bad. I mean, I did have it bad, but I'm sure others had it bad too. I share these examples to say that there's a way to present them where you kind of gloss over them, like, oh, my dad just had some anger problems, or oh, my parents just had a bad marriage. But that doesn't really do full justice to what that sort of role really does to a developing child. And so I think it's important, if you had similar experiences, to maybe take a second look at them, or maybe my examples will open your eyes to some examples in your own upbringing, and to just really sit with, like, wow, that must have really affected me and really affected how I relate in adult relationships. So, my parents' marriage, it was definitely abusive. My dad was abusing my mom. They were both abusing me. And not only was I carrying the emotional weight of their abuse of me, but my mother pushed me to shoulder the emotional weight of my father's abuse of her as well. She was constantly like venting about him and the things that he was doing to her. And as an adult, I recognized that as abuse. But again, I was not a therapist. I was a 14-year-old child. It was not my job to counsel her in this abusive marriage. Okay, now for practical advice of, how do you actually stop caretaking other people's emotions and start focusing on your own emotions instead? I think step one is, of course, to get to safety, which for me meant not being a kid anymore, becoming an adult, becoming independent, cutting my parents out of my life. For other people, that could mean different things. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to mean 100% cutting off parents or caregivers, attachment figures, that sort of thing. But I do think that you can't make the shift from being responsible for others' emotions to being responsible for your own emotions if you're still in a situation where other people's emotions affect your safety. Like they might, get into a rage and break something, or yeah, like those examples that I gave from when I was a child. But after step one, getting to safety, then I think it's more about just like practicing skills in real time, which is really hard. And I mess up all the time. But the only thing that has helped me get better has been to just practice it. So you can separate my emotions from their emotions in real time. My responsibility from their responsibility. So if a strong emotion is showing up, you can pause and ask yourself, is this feeling actually about me? Or am I tracking someone else's state? At the very least, that interrupts the automatic caretaking reflex. Even if you then go on to like caretake them anyway, at least practicing recognizing, wait, is this my emotion or is this their emotion? It at least interrupts the automatic um, nature of it. Of course, the ideal thing would be, hold on, whose emotion is this? Oh, wait, it's their emotion. They're angry. Their anger is not my responsibility. I can offer support. I can let them vent if I had the capacity, but, it's not my responsibility to drop my sense of self just to make their anger go away. And so the ideal thing is to recognize, this is their emotion, it's not my responsibility, and kind of have that boundary there. But alongside that, you can also name the role, even when you mess up. Be like, oh, I just stepped into fixer mode. I just stepped into caretaker mode. Oops. Oops, I just spent the past hour being my friend's emotional manager when I had something that I needed emotional support for, but I felt like I couldn't bring it up. So I just became their caretaker instead. Just naming that can create some distance and again reduce the just automatic jumping into the role. I have found that to be really helpful. And of course, being gentle with myself, not being like, "Oh, you stupid shit, you became a caretaker again." No, just being like, "Oops. Oops, I became a caretaker again." That sort of thing. "Oops, I forgot my keys inside, got to go back and get them." That type of thing. It's an oops, not not a reason for character assassination on yourself. Um and also delayed responses. Again, this is really hard. I feel like, especially for like autistic people who already struggle, at least I do, struggle with like synchronous communication. Like if you're face to face with someone, it can be really hard coming up with authentic answers and not just jumping into masking. But pause whenever you can before responding instead of instantly jumping in to regulate the other person. And I find this particularly helpful to practice with, like, for instance, if someone's texting you, they're like, "Oh, do you have a minute? Like, I really need support." And if you do have a minute and you have capacity, that's great. But pause and be like, "Do I have a minute? Or do I have a work meeting in 10 minutes and this will not, you know, this will dysregulate me before the work meeting? Do I have the capacity or have I been listening to this person complain about this thing every day for the past week and I'm just really worn out by it and I just need a break." So pausing and checking and just being like, even if you think and you're like, I could respond right now, just be like, maybe just wait. Maybe just set a timer for 10 minutes and then come back. Or if it's verbally in person, you can do something like, oh, let me check my calendar. Like if they're asking you, oh, let's hang out again next week or something. You can be like, oh, let me check my calendar. Even if you know you're free, just like pull your phone up and pretend to be looking at your calendar app. It's to give yourself a second. Or my favorite, be like, I don't know. I have to go home and check my calendar on my work computer. Whatever it is. Just something to give yourself some time. And I actually think I have I have like 10 more things on this list that I made. Um, but I think that's kind of a lot for one episode. So I'm going to actually turn this into a second episode to continue kind of delving more into this list, delving more into the practical strategies. Because I think the practical strategies are very helpful. They're very necessary to talk about. Like, we can talk all we want about recognizing parentification, and that is certainly absolutely the first step is recognizing it for what it is, recognizing automatic caretaking, recognizing associating love with obligation. Like, that's certainly the first step. But I feel like in order to actually change something in yourself, at least for me, I had to list out the practical ways to do it and then actually do them. So anyway, I want to give proper significance to these practical ways of going about this. So I will pause this here for now, and I will see you all in a couple weeks to continue digging into this topic. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If anything in this episode resonated with you and you'd like to share a thought, reflection, or bit of feedback, you're very welcome to email me. And if this podcast feels supportive or meaningful to you, I'd appreciate it if you left an honest review or shared it with someone who might also find it helpful. That's how this work finds the people that it's meant for. You've been listening to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, and I wish you a safe journey home.